Hey Rebel Rouser, I'm Alan Voivod and this is Star Wars 7x7. We're at episode number 1626 today and continuing our series of looks at the timeline right around the sequel movies and other new information that we've gotten that, hey, let's at least look at that because we don't have a sequel era movie coming out in December of 2018. We have to wait one more year for that. So the question that came up as I was looking at this particular story that we're going to talk about is, when exactly did Han and Chewie leave the Resistance? So first of all, let's just say right off the bat that we're talking about the Poe Dameron Annual #2 because Han and Chewie show up in it. And this is, of course, a spoiler-filled podcast, so if for some reason you don't want to hear what the deal is with that story, then you should save this show for a later date. But if you're okay with me talking about it, then let's talk about it. Basically, the story of the annual is that the Resistance needs money, surprise, surprise, and C-3PO has got an idea. There's somebody who has come into possession of a certain data archive, and it may even have the plans for some sort of super weapon in that data archive. And allegedly the First Order is after it, but the Resistance has to get to it first. And not only is the data potentially valuable, but the material of which the data archive is made is also very valuable as well. So they go to try to get it. Meanwhile, it turns out that it isn't really the First Order who's after this thing. It's Han and Chewie who have stolen a First Order shuttle from another criminal clan, and they're impersonating the First Order to try to get this data archive because they're going to sell it themselves and try to get some money to pay off some debts. Now, the thing of it is that at this point, they are not part of the Resistance. They are operating on their own. And there is a note in the opening crawl of the annual, and that note says that General Leia has formed the Resistance to defend the vulnerable New Republic and stem the tide of the First Order's power before it consumes the galaxy, but support for the movement has been hard to secure. Even Leia's husband, Han Solo, has left the rebel life and returned to his smuggling ways. Now, that's kind of a wild statement to begin with because it doesn't even acknowledge the whole Ben Solo-Kylo Ren thing whatsoever, which probably is something that they're keeping quiet, I imagine. I mean, I think probably, Leia isn't talking about Ben Solo being Kylo Ren or anything like that, and neither is Han. And so the breakup, I'm sure they're not talking about it being involved around their son. And we know that Luke disappears after everything goes down anyway. It seems like he's nowhere in the Resistance scenario to begin with. So let's dial it back. Basically what we find out is that the data archive is actually what remains of the library of Alderaan, and she knew apparently that this was going to be the case. Leia did, and now at least she has the data. She can still sell the original as a collector's item, but she's going to at least copy the data so that that much survives. And there's your story. And it's a decent story because it turns out that the Resistance is, after this thing as well. And Han and Chewie realize, oh, wait a minute, this is the Resistance coming after this. Let's clear a path for him. And so Poe Dameron ends up being the one to recover this thing off of some smuggler's ship. Never sees Han and Chewie, and Han and Chewie are actually just kind of, knocking heads around in the background so that way they can have safe passage, or that Poe and BB-8 can have safe passage through the ship. So there's never any intimation that they've encountered Han and Chewie as part of this whole thing at all. But it got me to thinking about the question of when Han and Chewie actually left the Resistance. And we can narrow it down only a little bit, unfortunately. So we know this much. The Resistance was started 28 ABY, and The Force Awakens happens in 34 ABY. And dialing it back a little bit more, C-3PO has his red arm in this thing, and it's basically 33 ABY when he gets that. So roughly, now we've narrowed it down to 5 years out of 6. Okay, it's not a heck of a lot. But when the two of them talk, Leia and Han, in The Force Awakens about how, they, went back to the only things they ever knew, that kind of conversation is such that it feels like it has to have been longer rather than shorter. So if you were to say, draw a line down the middle and say, if we're only talking about 5 years from 28 to 33 ABY, draw a line down the middle and call it 2.5. Is that the kind of thing that you would say after 2.5 years? I'm not thinking so. I feel like it's really, has to have been, closer to 5 years. So I would say that, Han and Chewie have to have been gone from the Resistance since about, 30 ABY and probably even closer to 29 ABY. And so we're talking about 4 or 5 years, which means that it's been 4 or 5 years since they've found out that Ben Solo has turned to the dark side and become Kylo Ren. Maybe it's the case that it actually did happen, that the whole Ben Solo, Kylo Ren thing happened much earlier than that. And, maybe it had already happened by the time of the novel Star Wars Bloodline and they just didn't find out about it. But I would say that we're talking about 4 to 5 years before, by the time Han and Chewie actually leave the Resistance. And so that is my take on that particular subject, and I would love to hear what yours is as well. So please do drop me a comment wherever you happen to be catching this episode, or do it at sw7x7.com at the blog post for the show's episode if you prefer. And that is going to do it, with the exception of just a couple more things. One of which is, of course, please consider subscribing to the show if you're not already doing it, wherever you happen to like to catch it. And also, I hope you will consider supporting this daily dose of Star Wars joy by joining the community at patreon.com/SW7x7. For now, though, it just remains for me to say thank you so much for joining me for this episode, and may the Force be with you, wherever in the world you may be.
This podcast is not endorsed or sponsored yet by Lucasfilm Limited, Disney, or 20th Century Fox, and is intended for entertainment and information purposes only. Star Wars, the Star Wars logo, all names and pictures of Star Wars characters, vehicles, and any other Star Wars-related items are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of Lucasfilm Limited or their respective trademark and copyright holders. May the Force be with them. All original content is copyright 2018 Star Wars 7x7. We hope you love it!